Imagine waking up every day feeling trapped, yet not knowing the walls that surround you exist. You move through life as though every step is necessary, every thought indispensable, every emotion permanent. But beneath the surface, an invisible cage holds you, shaping your reactions, clouding your choices, and quietly stealing your peace. This is the story of the prisoner, a figure not bound by chains, not locked behind bars, yet confined in a cell that no key can open. The doors of this prison are invisible, yet their presence is undeniable. They are the walls we build with our attachments, the locks we forge with our fears, and the chains we accept with our desires. And most striking of all, we don't even realize we are prisoners. In the heart of Buddhist teachings lies a profound understanding of this very confinement. The Buddha once spoke of suffering, not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of clinging. Attachment to the fleeting, to what cannot last, constructs a cage from which the mind struggles to escape. Desire, aversion, ignorance, the three poisons act like invisible wardens, reinforcing the boundaries we cannot see. Yet the paradox is simple and striking. Freedom is not somewhere far away. It is not a distant land, a hidden treasure, or a reward for the chosen few. Freedom is present, quietly waiting, like a silent room beyond the walls. The question is, how do we find it? How does the prisoner see the door that has always been within reach, yet invisible for a lifetime? Think of a man living his whole life inside a house without windows. The sunlight has always touched the roof, yet he never notices its warmth. The world outside could offer him beauty, laughter, and peace, but he has become accustomed to the dim corridors and echoing walls of his own making. Similarly, each of us walks through life, unaware that our cage is self-imposed. The first step in this journey is recognition. Awareness of the cage does not break the bars instantly, but it awakens the mind. It allows us to see the mechanisms of our own confinement, the stories we tell ourselves, the illusions we chase, and the patterns that repeat endlessly. These realizations are uncomfortable. They pierce through the comforting layers of denial, but they are necessary. Without this recognition, the door to freedom remains hidden, and the prisoner wanders in circles, seeking escape in the wrong directions. And yet, there is hope. Even in the darkest prisons, even when the walls seem impenetrable, the door is never truly locked. This is not a tale of despair. It is the beginning of awakening. It is the gentle whisper reminding us that within the heart of our suffering lies the seed of liberation. Every breath, every moment of mindfulness, every act of letting go becomes a key to seeing what was always there. Picture the prisoner standing in the center of a vast, shadowed room. Around him, the walls rise high, painted with the memories of past regrets, fears of the future, and clinging to fleeting pleasures. The floor trembles under the weight of unexamined desires. He turns, searching for an exit, perhaps blaming others, perhaps hoping that salvation will arrive from beyond the walls. But salvation does not arrive. It is discovered, and discovery begins with seeing the invisible. This chapter, this moment, is the invitation. It calls not only to the prisoner but to every one of us who has felt the subtle tightness of an unseen cage. You may not recognize it yet, but you have been walking its corridors, step by step, thought by thought. And now you are beginning to notice the door. The cage may feel real. The fear of stepping through may feel terrifying. But the path to freedom begins with the acknowledgement of the walls, the recognition of the lock, and the courage to turn the key that has been in your hand all along. And so, the story begins, not with the breaking of the cage, but with seeing it for what it is. The prisoner is not a victim, nor is he condemned. He is simply unaware until now. A single choice, a single awareness, a single breath. These are the first steps toward the door. And just beyond that door, the journey of discovery, transformation, and liberation awaits. The walls of the cage are deceptive. They appear solid, immovable, and inevitable. But the truth is, most of these walls exist only in the mind. They are built from habits, assumptions, and fears that have been accepted as reality. The prisoner believes he is trapped, yet the confinement is largely of his own making. Consider how often we measure ourselves by standards that were never ours to begin with. A word spoken carelessly, a failure remembered vividly, a desire left unfulfilled. All of these create invisible bricks that line the corridors of our prison. We cling to them, believing they define us, while the freedom outside remains unnoticed, like sunlight beyond a fogged window. In Buddhist philosophy, this is the essence of delusion. Our suffering is often less about the events themselves and more about the way we perceive them. Attachment magnifies pain. Aversion magnifies fear. We are prisoners not because life is harsh, but because we have accepted the illusion that we are powerless within it. The cage, it turns out, is woven from thoughts and emotions that have taken on a life of their own. Take desire, for example. We chase after fleeting pleasures, believing that fulfillment will bring lasting satisfaction. Yet each grasp only tightens the cage, for the momentary joy fades, and with its passing comes longing, frustration, and more craving. The cycle is endless. The prisoner reaches for freedom outside, not realizing that the chains around his heart were forged by the very things he sought. Aversion works in parallel. We resist the things we do not like, the uncomfortable, the painful, the inconvenient. Resistance builds walls of bitterness and resentment. Every "I cannot stand this" or "I must escape that" is a nail in the structure that confines us. The mind becomes a cell where we are both jailer and captive. And then there is ignorance, the most subtle and persistent of all. Ignorance is not merely a lack of information. It is a failure to see clearly, to perceive the nature of reality as it is. We mistake impermanent things for permanent, suffering for pleasure, self for others. We misinterpret the world, and in doing so, we misinterpret ourselves. The cage is constructed not by circumstance, but by misunderstanding. The prisoner often searches for escape externally. He may look for possessions, relationships, or achievements to break the walls. Yet, external solutions can never free a mind that is confined by its own illusions. The door to freedom is never hidden by others. It is obscured by the prisoner's own inability to see. Imagine the prisoner standing in a room that seems endless, the walls stretching in every direction. Shadows of past regrets flicker across the surfaces. The air is thick with the weight of unexamined thoughts. And yet he holds the key, the awareness that there may be another way, a different perception, a mind uncluttered by illusions. The challenge is simple, and yet profound, to see the walls for what they truly are. This insight begins with mindfulness, the gentle practice of observing without judgment. To notice the craving that pulls, the fear that constricts, the story that traps without clinging or resisting. Each moment of awareness loosens a brick, weakens a bar, and brightens the space around the mind. Slowly, imperceptibly, the cage begins to reveal itself as fragile, even illusory. The prisoner may resist this recognition at first. The walls, after all, have been familiar companions for a lifetime. Letting go is frightening because for the first time the mind faces uncertainty. But the irony is profound. Only by facing the truth of the cage can the prisoner find true freedom. The illusion itself becomes the teacher, pointing the way toward clarity and liberation. And so, the prisoner stands at a threshold, not of the world outside, but of perception within. The cage is not disappearing, it is being understood. The chains are not breaking, they are being seen. Awareness is the light that reveals the prison for what it truly is, and with this illumination, the mind begins to imagine a different possibility, a door, once hidden, now within reach. In this revelation, there is both discomfort and hope. The discomfort comes from recognizing the extent of one's own entrapment. The hope arises from understanding that the prison was never absolute. It was constructed by thought, emotion, and ignorance, all of which can be unmade with patience, insight, and compassion. And as the prisoner contemplates this new perspective, the faint outline of a door begins to appear, not in the walls of the cell, but in the mind itself. A door that will not open with force or struggle, but with awareness, acceptance, and the courage to step forward. The illusion of confinement has been exposed, Yet the journey has only begun. The walls are seen, the cage acknowledged, and the first steps toward freedom quietly beckon. Beyond the perception of limitation lies a path of discovery, waiting for the one willing to walk it. The prisoner has seen the walls. He has recognized the illusion of confinement. And yet, standing in the center of his shadowed cell, he realizes that seeing is not enough. To truly be free, he must find the key. But the key is not hidden in the corners of the room, nor buried beneath the weight of past mistakes. It is not held by another, nor bought with possessions, power, or praise. The key has always been within him, waiting patiently, like a seed beneath the soil, unseen but alive. In Buddhist wisdom, this key is called awareness, mindfulness, insight. It is the ability to witness the mind without being entangled in its patterns. It is the gentle, persistent recognition that thoughts arise and fade, emotions flow and change, and the self is not a fixed entity but a process of fleeting experiences. This realization is the lockpicker, the liberator, the companion that walks silently beside the prisoner through the corridors of illusion. The prisoner begins to explore this key. At first, it is subtle, a breath noticed, a thought observed without judgment, a fleeting emotion acknowledged without clinging. These small acts of attention are like turning the first few tumblers in a complex lock. They do not shatter the walls, but they weaken them. They remind the prisoner that he has a choice every moment, every thought, every action. And then the key becomes more tangible. Meditation, the practice of sitting with oneself in stillness, becomes the doorway to deeper understanding. Here, the prisoner learns to watch the mind as clouds drift across a vast sky, neither clinging to the storm nor fleeing from it. Every distraction, every urge, every pang of desire or fear is observed with gentle curiosity. The walls of the cage remain, but they begin to feel less solid, less immovable. The prisoner discovers another aspect of the key, compassion, not only for others but for himself. He realizes that self-criticism, regret, and shame are additional locks on the door. Each time he softens toward his own suffering, the key turns a little more freely. Understanding, patience, and forgiveness dissolve the barriers that the mind has mistakenly fortified. Insight follows patience. The prisoner begins to see patterns that have governed his life. The recurring fears, the endless cravings, the attachments that promised happiness but delivered suffering, they are all visible now. Recognition alone does not free him, but it points the way. Freedom is not an act of escaping. It is an act of seeing clearly and responding wisely. Imagine the prisoner holding the key, feeling its weight, its potential, yet uncertain of the next step. The key does not force the lock. It only invites him to turn it. And the turning is a choice. The choice to let go of what has kept him bound. The choice to step beyond the illusion of control. The choice to embrace the unknown with trust. And here lies the paradox. The key has always been present, yet it is only discovered through practice, through patience, and through courage. No one can hand it over, no external ritual can replace the inner work. Each moment of mindfulness, each act of conscious attention, each moment of letting go, slowly, quietly, shapes the path to the door. The prisoner begins to understand that the key is not a single object or revelation. It is a practice, a way of living, awareness in motion, insight in action, compassion in thought, word, and deed. And as he turns the key again and again, he notices subtle shifts. The walls are less imposing, the shadows less frightening, the air lighter with possibility. He realizes that freedom is not a sudden event but a gradual unfolding. Like dawn breaking over a dark horizon, the light does not rush in all at once. It spreads slowly, illuminating corners previously unnoticed, revealing the contours of the room, the outlines of the door, and the space beyond. And in this unfolding, the prisoner discovers a profound truth. The door to freedom was never hidden outside. It was obscured by ignorance, fear, and attachment. Now, with the key in hand, the key of awareness, mindfulness, and compassion, he begins to see it clearly. The door has always been waiting. It is not locked, only waiting for the recognition that he has always carried the power to open it. And so, standing at the threshold of possibility, the prisoner feels both awe and anticipation. The walls of the cell remain, but they no longer define him. The cage has not disappeared, but its power over him has diminished. The key is in his hand, the door is in sight, and the first steps toward liberation are real, tangible, and profoundly transformative. The journey is just beginning. The key within will continue to guide him through the remaining locks of habit, the shadows of fear, and the lingering chains of illusion. And beyond the door, waiting silently, is the freedom he has sought not in vain, but in the deepest chambers of his own heart. Even with the key in hand, the path to freedom is far from simple. Awareness, mindfulness, and compassion have opened a glimpse of possibility, but the journey itself is riddled with obstacles. These are not walls of stone or iron, but subtler, more persistent. They are the habits, fears, and illusions that have shaped the prisoner's mind for a lifetime. The first obstacle is the self itself, or rather, the illusions of the self. The prisoner must confront the habits and patterns that have become so familiar that they feel like truth. Repetitive thoughts, emotional reactions, and unconscious desires create invisible barriers that pull him back even as he reaches toward freedom. Each time he takes a step forward, the old patterns whisper, "You cannot escape. You are bound. This is who you are." Then comes the obstacle of fear. Fear of letting go, fear of uncertainty, fear of loss. The prisoner realizes that freedom is not only about stepping into light, but also about leaving something behind. And leaving behind, even illusions, attachments, or old identities, can feel terrifying. We are conditioned to cling, to resist change, and to believe that the familiar, however painful, is safer than the unknown. Attachment, too, is a formidable adversary. The prisoner must face the desires and cravings that have defined his sense of comfort and identity. The objects of longing, possessions, achievements, relationships, approval, are not inherently evil, yet the grip of attachment transforms them into invisible chains. Every craving is a tether. Every clinging thought is a weight that pulls him back into the cage. Anger, resentment, and aversion form another layer of the obstacle course. Past grievances, injustices, or perceived slights are carried like stones in the pockets of the mind. The prisoner discovers that the hardest chains are often those forged by memory and judgment. To move forward, he must learn the difficult art of letting go, not suppressing anger but seeing it clearly, understanding its roots, and releasing it without self-condemnation. And then there is the subtle obstacle of impatience. The prisoner wants freedom quickly, expecting the key to open the door instantly. Yet liberation is not a sudden event. It is a gradual unfolding, a transformation that occurs moment by moment. Impatience, doubt, and frustration act as internal saboteurs, tempting him to abandon the path before its rewards are realized. Distractions of the world also conspire to block the way. The prisoner must navigate a landscape filled with noise, opinions, and endless demands. Every interruption, every lure of comfort or entertainment, is a temptation to turn away from the inner work. The mind seeks ease and distraction, as though any moment of stillness will reveal the emptiness of its own illusion. Perhaps the most insidious obstacle is subtle ignorance, the tendency to mistake insight for liberation. The prisoner may feel enlightened in fleeting moments of clarity, yet old habits and unconscious patterns persist. Awareness must be continually cultivated, patience continually practiced, and the path continually walked. Enlightenment is not a destination but a living process of discovery. Imagine the prisoner climbing a steep, rocky path. Each step is uncertain, the stones slippery with doubt and fear. Sometimes he stumbles, sometimes he hesitates. The key in his hand is a light, but the shadows of old conditioning stretch far and wide. And yet with each step he learns. Each stumble is a lesson, each hesitation a chance to observe the mind's reactions without judgment. The obstacles are not punishments, they are teachers. They reveal where attachment lingers, where fear thrives, and where insight is incomplete. The path itself becomes a mirror, reflecting the inner landscape of the prisoner's mind. To confront obstacles is not merely to endure them, but to understand them, to learn from them, and ultimately to transcend them. And so, the prisoner continues, mindful of every thought, every impulse, every resistance. The key is in his hand, yet the journey demands courage, patience, and unwavering attention. The obstacles will not vanish. They are part of the process. But with each step, the walls feel less constraining, the shadows less frightening, and the door, a door glimpsed in moments of clarity, edges closer into view. The path is not straight, nor is it easy. But every obstacle navigated, every fear faced, every attachment loosened, brings the prisoner nearer to the profound realization that true freedom is not given. It is discovered, cultivated, and realized from within. And somewhere beyond these trials, waiting patiently, is the next moment of insight, a realization that will illuminate the door itself, revealing that the freedom sought was never outside, but always within reach. After navigating the twisting corridors of illusion and confronting the obstacles that sought to confine him, the prisoner arrives at a quiet, still point, a moment pregnant with possibility. It is here, in the subtle silence between thoughts, that insight begins to stir. Not a loud revelation, not a dramatic epiphany, but a soft, undeniable knowing that shifts the mind forever. He notices first that the walls he had feared are not as solid as he imagined. The chains that seemed unbreakable are revealed as constructs of his own perception. Each attachment, each fear, each clinging thought that once held him in place is seen clearly for what it is, temporary, changeable, and ultimately insubstantial. In this moment, he realizes a truth central to the Buddha's teaching. Suffering does not arise from the world outside, but from the mind itself. The clinging, the craving, the resistance, all have been shaping his experience, creating a prison from which he felt no escape. Awareness strips away the illusion. Suddenly, the self that seemed so fixed and defined feels fluid, like water flowing freely in a river. He feels a profound sense of relief, as though the weight of countless lifetimes has been lifted from his shoulders. It is not joy in the ordinary sense, nor is it an excitement tied to worldly events. It is a deep, unshakable peace, an inner quietude that has nothing to prove or defend. For the first time, the prisoner experiences freedom, not in the absence of walls, but in the understanding of them. This insight carries another revelation, the power of choice. Though the obstacles remain and the path ahead is still steep and uncertain, he now sees that he is not bound to old patterns. Desire, fear, and aversion no longer dictate his every move. Every thought becomes an opportunity to respond with clarity, every emotion an invitation to observe without reaction. He is no longer a passive prisoner. He is an active participant in the unfolding of his own liberation. The prisoner notices the simplicity of the truth. Freedom is not something to be grasped outside. It is discovered within, in the delicate art of letting go. To release is not to abandon life, but to embrace it fully without clinging to what comes and goes. To surrender is not weakness, but the strength to see reality as it is, impermanent, interdependent, and free from the chains of craving. This moment of insight is subtle, yet transformative. It is like the first rays of dawn breaking through a long night, illuminating the contours of the mind that were previously hidden in shadow. Each ray exposes illusions, dissolves doubts, and reveals the contours of a door, still faint, still untested, but unmistakably there. And then comes the profound stillness. The prisoner realizes that he does not need to rush, to force, or to struggle. Insight is not a destination, but a lens through which the journey itself is seen differently. The mind breathes more freely. The heart beats with a gentle steadiness. The cages of past regret and future worry fade into perspective, no longer tyrannical, no longer defining the present. Compassion arises naturally in this awareness. Not only compassion for others, but compassion for himself, for the years spent in confusion, for the moments of suffering born from ignorance. He sees the interconnectedness of all beings and feels a resonance with the silent struggles carried by others. Insight opens the door not just to freedom, but to empathy and understanding, linking liberation with love and kindness. The prisoner is not yet fully free, but he has glimpsed the possibility. He has experienced what it means to step beyond habitual confinement, to see the truth without distortion, and to recognize that the chains are optional, the cage a choice. Insight is both a spark and a guide. It illuminates the next steps while revealing the nature of the obstacles that remain. And in this delicate balance, he senses the next movement of the journey, the door itself, not as an abstract idea but as a tangible possibility. With awareness as his guide and compassion as his companion, he prepares to approach it, ready to face whatever lies beyond. For now, the prisoner stands still, letting the understanding sink deep into his being. Every breath, every heartbeat, every quiet moment becomes a reminder that freedom is not distant. It is here, waiting, accessible through insight, patience, and unwavering attention. The journey continues, not in desperation but with quiet curiosity, as the prisoner moves closer to the threshold where perception meets reality, and the door to freedom slowly, unmistakably, begins to reveal itself. After the quiet revelation of insight, the prisoner senses something shifting in the room. It is subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a faint outline at the edge of perception, a suggestion of a possibility that had always existed, yet remained unseen. And then slowly, unmistakably, the door appears. This door is not made of wood or metal. It is not adorned with locks or handles. Its presence is felt more than seen, like a vibration in the air or a gentle warmth in the heart. It embodies the freedom that has been waiting patiently within him, revealed only when the mind becomes still enough to recognize it. The prisoner approaches cautiously, aware that the appearance of the door does not mean liberation is automatic. The door is symbolic and real at once. It represents clarity, discernment, and the ability to move beyond the illusions that have confined him for so long. It is the culmination of awareness, patience, and insight, made tangible in the form of possibility. In Buddhist terms, this is the moment where wisdom and compassion converge. The door is the boundary between ignorance and understanding, between clinging and letting go. It stands as a threshold that requires courage to cross, yet offers a glimpse of the boundless space beyond, the freedom that arises when attachment and fear no longer dominate the mind. The prisoner notices the beauty of the door. It is not grand or ornate, but simple, serene, and inviting. It does not demand effort to open, only readiness. The key he holds, the awareness he has cultivated through mindfulness, meditation, and compassion, fits perfectly. But fitting the key is not enough. He must be willing to turn it, to step forward, and to embrace the unknown. Every step toward the door illuminates what has been hidden. The shadows of doubt, fear, and attachment that once seemed overwhelming shrink as he draws nearer. The obstacles encountered along the path, the habits of thought, the cravings, the emotional turbulence, remain, but their power diminishes. They are no longer walls but traces of the journey, reminders of what he has overcome. The prisoner pauses, aware that the door is both threshold and invitation. To step through is not an act of escaping the world, but an act of embracing life in its true nature. It is a step into presence, into clarity, into a state where the mind is no longer shackled by its own illusions. Beyond the door, freedom is not an abstract concept. It is a living, breathing experience of awareness, balance, and inner peace. He realizes that the door is not only an opening for himself. It is a symbol of potential for all who seek liberation. The teachings of the Buddha, the insights cultivated through practice, and the understanding of impermanence and interconnectedness, all converge at this threshold. The door represents the universal possibility of freedom that exists in every conscious being willing to see and step beyond the confines of the mind. As he stands before it, the prisoner senses the transformative power of choice. To open the door is to accept responsibility for his own liberation. To remain is to cling to the familiar, to continue a life constrained by fear and desire. But the temptation of freedom is irresistible. The door waits patiently, not judging, not pushing, simply inviting him to move forward. And then with a deep, steadying breath, he turns the key. The act is gentle, almost imperceptible, yet it resonates through every fiber of his being. The door opens, not with a clang or creak, but with the soft, luminous assurance that comes when understanding meets readiness. Light spills into the room, revealing the contours of reality that were previously hidden in shadow. The prisoner steps forward, feeling the first touch of liberation on his skin, in his mind, and within his heart. Freedom is not a distant reward. It is the natural unfolding of insight, courage, and compassion. Every fear left behind, every attachment loosened, every act of mindful awareness has led to this singular moment. The door, once invisible, now open, beckoning him into the vastness of possibility. And yet the journey continues. The door is not the end, it is a threshold. Beyond it lies the deeper practice of living with awareness, compassion, and wisdom. The prisoner has found the doorway, but to walk fully into freedom requires continued courage, attention, and care. The door is revealed, but the path beyond it is an adventure of ongoing discovery, transformation, and awakening. The door stands before him, luminous and inviting, yet crossing it requires more than curiosity. It demands courage. The prisoner takes a deep breath, feeling the weight of every fear, every habit, every attachment he has carried. And in that moment, he understands. The threshold is not just a line to step over. It is a transformation in perception. With each step forward, the familiar constraints of the cage begin to dissolve. The shadows of doubt and anxiety that once seemed endless lose their grip. He notices that freedom is not found by escaping the walls, but by seeing them clearly and choosing not to be bound by them. Awareness, compassion, and insight, the key he has nurtured, guide him, like gentle hands leading him across unseen terrain. The first step is uncertain, even trembling, yet it carries the power of realization. Every movement forward is a declaration that he is no longer a passive participant in his own confinement. The air beyond the threshold feels different, lighter, expansive, resonant with possibility. The mind begins to stretch, no longer compressed by fear or desire, but open, attentive, and alive. He feels the subtle shift immediately. Thoughts no longer dictate reactions. Emotions no longer dominate behavior. The habitual patterns that once imprisoned him, the cravings, the aversions, the clinging to self-image, have not disappeared, but their control is broken. They exist as clouds in a vast sky, visible yet unobstructive, passing without incident. Crossing the threshold is also an encounter with impermanence. The prisoner recognizes that every sensation, every experience, every fleeting moment is transient. Clinging to them is unnecessary, for freedom lies not in possession but in observation, acceptance, and presence. The realization is liberating. Life, in its entirety, is alive, fleeting, and beautiful precisely because it cannot be grasped. And then comes a profound awareness of interconnectedness. The prisoner feels no separation between self and world, between inner and outer. The struggles he has faced, the illusions he has released, the insight he has gained, all resonate with the broader tapestry of existence. He sees that the liberation he experiences is not an isolated event, but part of a universal rhythm. Every being has the capacity to awaken, to release, and to move beyond confinement. Compassion deepens as he steps further into this freedom, not a sentimental or passive feeling, but an active, vivid recognition of the suffering of others, and a willingness to respond with understanding and care. The threshold has opened not only the mind, but the heart. Every action, every thought, every breath is infused with awareness, and each moment becomes an opportunity to act in harmony with wisdom. The prisoner realizes something crucial. The journey is ongoing. Crossing the threshold does not erase challenges, obstacles, or shadows. The world beyond the door has its own difficulties, yet they are no longer prisons. They are opportunities for practice, understanding, and growth. Freedom is not a static state. It is a dynamic, living experience of being fully present, fully awake, and fully compassionate. He pauses for a moment, taking in the expansiveness around him. The cage remains behind, a memory and a teacher. The door is now behind him, yet its significance continues, reminding him that the path to freedom requires continual mindfulness, patience, and courage. Each step forward is an affirmation that liberation is not found outside, but through conscious engagement with life itself. And in this crossing, the prisoner discovers the profound simplicity of liberation. It is not complicated, it is not distant, it is not elusive. It is here, in every breath, in every moment of awareness, in every act of letting go and embracing what is. The threshold has been crossed, yet the path beyond it is a living, breathing journey of awakening. The prisoner moves forward, not with haste, but with quiet clarity. The walls of the old cage, once formidable, now feel distant and insubstantial. The light of understanding fills the mind, the heart, and the soul. He has crossed the threshold and in doing so, has stepped into a space where freedom, peace, and presence are inseparable. And as he walks, he begins to realize that this crossing is not an end, but a doorway into deeper exploration. A living practice of insight, compassion, and mindfulness, where each moment is both the journey and the destination. The moment of crossing the threshold changes everything, yet it is only the beginning. As the prisoner moves into the open space beyond the door, he feels an internal shift that is subtle, yet undeniable. Freedom is not a place he has arrived at. It is a transformation that courses quietly through every fiber of his being. He notices the heart beating with a gentleness he has never felt before. Emotions that once surged like storms now flow with clarity, without overwhelming him. Anger, fear, and craving still arise, but they no longer command his attention. They are like waves in the ocean, visible, real, yet never defining the vastness of the sea itself. The mind, once restless and bound by patterns of anxiety and desire, now experiences a remarkable clarity. Thoughts arise and fade without leaving residue. Awareness has become both the lamp and the observer, illuminating the inner landscape while maintaining serenity amidst whatever arises. The old cage, with its bars of attachment and chains of fear, now seems distant and insubstantial. But the most profound change is not in perception alone, it is in being. The prisoner discovers a quiet strength, a steadiness that comes from knowing that true liberation is cultivated moment by moment, not grasped all at once. The self, once fragile and reactive, now experiences continuity without clinging. He can move through life without being pulled into its dramas, yet still participate fully present and fully awake. Compassion deepens naturally. With the dissolution of self-centered fear and attachment, he sees the suffering of others clearly, not as a threat, but as a reflection of interconnected existence. Kindness arises effortlessly, without effort or calculation, flowing outward in actions, words, and even silent presence. The transformation is complete in its simplicity, a mind free from illusion, a heart open to life. Daily experiences take on a new dimension. Ordinary moments, drinking water, feeling the breeze, hearing a bird, are no longer unnoticed. Each sensation is imbued with vivid presence, a reminder that freedom is not distant, but alive in every instant. The prisoner realizes that liberation is not an escape from life, but a full immersion into it, seen with clarity and embraced with wisdom. Old habits, old attachments, and old fears still arise, but they no longer hold dominion. Every moment of mindfulness becomes a reaffirmation of freedom, every act of letting go a strengthening of inner peace. The prisoner understands that transformation is ongoing, a living process, yet its impact is already tangible. He walks differently now, with steadiness, grace, and an ease that comes from inner alignment. The transformation is not only personal, it is relational. The prisoner notices interactions with others are no longer filtered through desire or aversion. Conversations become opportunities for understanding. Gestures of care become natural, and conflicts are met with equanimity rather than reaction. In this way, the inner change radiates outward, touching the world gently like ripples across still water. And in this state, he glimpses the profound simplicity of freedom. It is not extraordinary, it is not distant, it is not reserved for a select few. It is here, in the unfolding of awareness, in the practice of compassion, in the courage to remain present amidst uncertainty. Every breath, every thought, every heartbeat becomes an instrument of liberation. The prisoner realizes the paradoxical beauty of transformation. He is the same, yet entirely new. The experiences, the memories, the past struggles remain, yet they no longer define him. The self is fluid, responsive, and free. Life is no longer a prison, but a canvas of infinite possibility, painted with the colors of awareness, wisdom, and love. And as he moves forward, he senses the next stage of the journey, returning to the world beyond the threshold, carrying this transformation within, ready to engage with life fully awake, fully compassionate, and fully free. The transformation within is not merely a personal victory. It is the gateway to acting in harmony with the universe, to walking a path of insight, balance, and enduring peace. Having crossed the threshold and experienced the profound transformation within, the prisoner now turns toward the world he once knew. The cage remains behind him, yet the world outside, the same streets, faces, and routines, now feels different. He carries something invisible yet undeniable. Wisdom earned through experience, insight cultivated through awareness, and compassion deepened through understanding. Returning is not simply a matter of walking through doors or resuming old routines. It is a process of integration. The wisdom he carries must meet the realities of life, the same challenges, desires, and uncertainties that once imprisoned him. And yet, armed with insight, the familiar world now becomes a field of practice rather than a source of confinement. He notices the subtle shifts immediately. Conversations that once triggered impatience or defensiveness are now met with calm attentiveness. Frustrations that would have inflamed anger or resentment are observed, understood, and released. The external world has not changed, but his perception has. He understands that freedom does not come from altering circumstances, but from transforming the mind. Compassion now informs action. Small gestures, a smile, a helping hand, a patient response, carry more weight than before. Wisdom tempers his choices, guiding him to act with awareness rather than habit. He realizes that liberation is not a solitary achievement. It is expressed in the way he engages with others, in the kindness and presence he brings to the world. The prisoner also learns humility. Insight is not mastery over life, but clarity in the face of it. Mistakes, setbacks, and old tendencies still arise, yet they are no longer traps. They are opportunities to practice awareness, patience, and equanimity. Every challenge becomes a mirror, reflecting the mind's readiness to respond with wisdom rather than react with habit. As he walks through familiar streets, the ordinary is transformed. The chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, the smiles of strangers, all are seen with fresh eyes, alive with presence. The freedom he discovered within is not an escape from reality, but a deeper immersion in it. Life, in all its impermanence and unpredictability, is now experienced fully, consciously, and compassionately. The prisoner realizes that returning with wisdom is not a single act, but a continual practice. It is remembering the lessons learned in the quiet of the inner chamber, carrying the key of awareness into every interaction, every choice, and every moment. It is walking through the world as both observer and participant, never losing sight of the freedom discovered within. And he sees the broader truth. Every being has the capacity to awaken, to move beyond confinement, to cross thresholds of understanding and compassion. Wisdom is not hoarded. It radiates naturally, touching lives silently yet profoundly. By embodying awareness and love, he contributes to a world where freedom is not an abstract concept, but a lived reality accessible to all. The prisoner also discovers gratitude. For the journey, for the obstacles, for the insights, and for the quiet moments of clarity. Each step along the path, painful, challenging, or joyous, was necessary. The wisdom gained is inseparable from the experiences endured, the mistakes made, and the moments of stillness embraced. As he moves forward, the prisoner carries both the serenity of inner liberation and the responsibility to live it. The world may remain unpredictable and complex, yet he is no longer confined. He acts from a place of insight, responds from a place of compassion, and walks through life aware of its impermanence, interconnectedness, and beauty. Returning with wisdom is, paradoxically, both an ending and a beginning. It marks the completion of one stage of awakening, yet opens the door to ongoing practice, service, and engagement. The prisoner has crossed thresholds within and without, transforming both mind and heart. The journey continues, not as a struggle for freedom, but as the living expression of it. And as he moves through the world, he carries the quiet assurance that liberation is not distant or unattainable. It is present in every conscious choice, every act of compassion, every moment of awareness. The prisoner, now a traveler of both inner and outer landscapes, walks fully awake, fully free, and fully engaged with life itself. The journey comes full circle, yet it is clear that the story does not end here. The prisoner has crossed thresholds, discovered the key within, faced obstacles, glimpsed insight, stepped through the door, and returned to the world transformed. And yet the most profound truth remains. The door never truly closes. Freedom, he realizes, is not a place, not a destination, not a one-time achievement. It is a living reality, a practice, a perspective. The door is always present, sometimes hidden by fear, craving, or ignorance, but always accessible through awareness, compassion, and courage. Each moment offers a choice, to step forward into freedom or remain bound by illusion. The door remains open, inviting all who are willing to see. It is a symbol of hope, of possibility, of the power that lies within each of us. The walls of the cage are never permanent. They are constructs of thought, habit, and perception. And with each act of mindfulness, with each moment of letting go, the illusion weakens, revealing the path that has always been there. The prisoner understands that the journey is both personal and universal. The path of awakening is not only about crossing thresholds oneself, but about embodying freedom in the world, touching lives through awareness, presence, and compassion. Every kind action, every mindful breath, every choice made with clarity and love strengthens the door for others as well. He carries gratitude for the journey, the challenges that forged resilience, the fears that revealed courage, the attachments that taught letting go, and the moments of stillness that illuminated the path. The wisdom gained is not a trophy, but a living guide, a light that illuminates both inner and outer worlds. And as he moves forward, he realizes that the door is not only a passage to freedom, it is a mirror. It reflects the mind that perceives it, revealing the truth of impermanence, interconnectedness, and the boundless potential within each moment. Every encounter, every experience, every act of being becomes an opportunity to practice presence, understanding, and love. The door remains open for those who seek it, for those willing to cultivate awareness, confront illusion, and embrace life fully. It is patient, silent, and unwavering. And for the prisoner, now fully awake, it is not a symbol of an ending, but a beginning, an ongoing journey of liberation, insight, and compassion. As the light of understanding fills his being, he knows that the cage was never absolute. The key was always within, and the door has always been there, waiting, inviting, and open. Freedom is not granted by force or circumstance, but discovered within the quiet, attentive, compassionate heart. And so, the prisoner walks forward, not seeking escape, not chasing reward, but living fully awake, fully present, and fully free. The door remains open, as does the journey, and in every conscious step, the profound truth is clear. Liberation is always within reach, and every moment is an invitation to step through. The story may end here, but the door remains, waiting silently, patiently, for anyone ready to see, ready to awaken, and ready to walk the path of freedom. If this journey of the mind and heart resonated with you, and you feel inspired to explore the path of awareness, compassion, and freedom, consider subscribing to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Each week, we share teachings, stories, and reflections to guide you gently toward clarity and peace. Hit the bell so you won't miss a moment of insight, and join our community of seekers walking the path of mindfulness together. Remember, the door to wisdom is always open. Sometimes, all it takes is a mindful step.